Hello, the point of this video is to get you basically familiar with aerobic metabolism. As you'll see today, aerobic metabolism is our basal source of energy. It's our go-to. It's always running in the background. Right now, as you sit listening to this video, it's working. We're going to talk about aerobic metabolism. It's always going. First, we'll talk about what our major sources of energy are. And then we'll talk more specifically about aerobic metabolism, which is going to have a lot to do with this electron transport chain. So first off, we have three major energy systems. Whenever we do exercise or whenever our body does anything, it requires ATP. Here I've illustrated the ATP as a battery. It's actually not a double A or a triple A, it's a triple P, meaning that it has three phosphates, adenosine triphosphate. We use that adenosine triphosphate to power our muscular work. And as we use that ATP, it actually breaks it down into ADP, 2 Ps, and an inorganic phosphate, 1 P. Now we only have a very short supply, of this ATP. And so we have to be able to resynthesize it back to ATP. We take this ADP and the phosphate and shove it back together so that we can redo it. We recycle in our body. And the three ways that we recycle or resynthesize our ATP predominantly are the ATP phosphocreatine system, glycolysis, and aerobic metabolism. Each one of those systems has its own strengths. As I mentioned already, aerobic metabolism is always running in the background. It's your go-to. If you can meet all of your energy supply or energy demand with aerobic metabolism, you will. Anything that you can't meet with aerobic metabolism, then you move on to glycolysis, and for very severe, fast energy demand, you move on to ATP phosphocreatine. As you can see, aerobic metabolism can't generate high levels or sustain high levels of power or ATP resynthesis, but it can go on for a very, very long time. As I mentioned, it's always going. When you run a marathon or walk around the block, that's your predominant energy system, is aerobic metabolism. In contrast, if you're using glycolysis, that's what you would use predominantly during an 800-meter sprint. You can't hold that speed for very long, and even less with phosphocreatine, which is what you're predominantly using when you do a 100-meter sprint. You can go really fast, but not for very long. If we look at it in another way, we can look at the energy systems. We have phosphocreatine. It doesn't fuel a whole lot of work, but it can get you power quickly. Anaerobic glycolysis, also not a lot of work. Now here I have fat oxidation and carbohydrate oxidation. These are just the two different major types of aerobic metabolism. Both of them are aerobic metabolism, and they both fuel a lot of work. Fat oxidation more so than carbohydrates because you have a lot of fat stores. That's not a fat joke, everyone has a lot of fat. But when we exercise, especially at higher intensities, carbohydrate oxidation or aerobic metabolism of glucose is what we primarily use when we're at higher intensity. So we're going to focus in on that today. So how does aerobic metabolism work? If we look at aerobic metabolism, this slide's kind of busy, but I'll step you through it one by one. Aerobic metabolism, we can break it up into about 4 phases. First, let me orient you with this diagram. We have just any old muscle cell or any kind of cell. This would be a mitochondrion, and then out here is everything outside of the mitochondria, which would be the cytosol. And so the first step in glycolysis, or aerobic metabolism, is glycolysis, breaking the glucose, which here is represented by 6 carbons. You break the glucose down into pyruvate, which is 3 carbons. So now you take your 6-carbon glucose, split it in half, and now you get 2 pyruvates. In that process, you get 2 ATP and also 2 NADH. The NADH, they're kind of like energy shuttles. As you break the glucose down, you produce these electrons and hydrogen ions. The NADH and its kind of sister FADH2, they shuttle those the energy the electrons and the hydrogen ions to the mitochondria, and we'll see them later. So the first step is glycolysis, breaking glucose down into pyruvate. Step 2 is the conversion of pyruvate into acetyl-CoA, and for that to happen, pyruvate enters into the mitochondria, and shortly after getting in the mitochondria, it ditches one of its carbons in the form of a CO2, so we produce one CO2 here, and now we're left with a 2-carbon chain called acetyl-CoA. It hooks up with some cofactor here. So acetyl-CoA has the 2 carbons, and in that process, so in step 2, we produced 1 CO2 per acetyl-CoA, so per glucose, since there's 2 pyruvates, we would get 2 CO2s. Now the acetyl-CoA enters what we call the citric acid cycle. And in the citric acid cycle, the acetyl-CoA hooks up with oxaloacetate, or oxaloacetic acid as described here, basically the same thing. The acetyl-CoA hooks up with oxaloacetate, so you're taking a 2-carbon up with a 4-carbon chain to form a 6-carbon chain citric acid. Citric acid then goes through a series of steps, which we'll see can kind of get complicated here, where you're hooking up carbons, taking off carbons, moving things around, and in the process you produce 2 CO2 for every acetyl-CoA, and you also produce 3 NADH and 1 FADH2 per acetyl-CoA. Importantly, by the end of the cycle, as you've ripped things off and changed things around, you end up with oxaloacetate again, which can then bind with acetyl-CoA and do this whole cycle again. Overall, the citric acid cycle does not produce a lot of ATP. In fact, it doesn't directly produce any ATP. It produces 1 GTP, which is kind of a sister to ATP, which is quickly converted over to ATP to be utilized. What the citric acid cycle is more important for is the production of NADH and FADH2 and the CO2s. But more in terms of energy production, it's these, the NADHs and FADH2s. They're high energy, they're carrying electrons and hydrogen ions, which are going to go over to our next step, the electron transport chain. In the electron transport chain, these NADHs and FADHs that we've produced participate in a series of donating the hydrogens and the electrons across the mitochondrial membrane. And as they do that, we'll see in detail in a second, they produce a ton of ATP. Through the electron transport chain, we actually produce somewhere around 32 to 34 ATP for every glucose, depending on the efficiency of the mitochondrion. In addition, we also consume a lot of oxygen in this process in the electron transport chain. So one of the major reasons that you breathe is to have oxygen available to facilitate electron transport. And also another major reason you breathe is to get rid of this CO2 that you produce in the citric acid cycle and converting pyruvate to acetyl-CoA. Alright, so now let's look at these steps in a little more detail. The first step was glycolysis, taking the glucose down to pyruvate. I'm just going to show you this quickly. We're going to go into more detail on this on a separate day. So on another day, we'll talk about this process in much more detail about glycolysis. Right now, I just want you to focus on that glucose enters into the muscle cell, or whatever cell you're looking at, and that 6-carbon glucose is broken down through a series of steps into pyruvate. That pyruvate will then enter into the mitochondria for step 2, which is where it goes into the Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle. And during the citric acid cycle, it's going to produce a ton of NADH and FADH2. I'll give you more detail on what the citric acid cycle looks like. I don't care that you know all the enzymes and substrates in there. There are a couple of key things throughout all of this that I'll tell you about, like phosphofructokinase, some enzymes that are important, but don't worry about memorizing everything. So now let's focus in on what actually happens in aerobic metabolism, or the electron transport chain. So we're taking these NADHs that have been produced during glycolysis in the citric acid cycle, and they go into the mitochondria. The way we actually use this is a lot like how hydroelectric dams produce energy. It's all about gradients. On one side of this dam, Hoover Dam, which is right near Las Vegas where I grew up, you have a ton of water on one side and not a lot on the other. So there's this gradient of water. And as the water moves down the gradient from the side of high concentration and pressure to low concentration and pressure, it flows and causes a turbine down at the bottom to spin and move, and that is what actually produces the energy that powers Las Vegas Strip and a lot of Southern California and Arizona. Your mitochondria work fairly similarly. What happens is that in your mitochondria, we create a gradient. The NADHs and FADH2s are used to create a gradient of hydrogen ions. So instead of having a high concentration of water up here between the outer membrane and the inner membrane, in this inner membrane space, we actually have a high concentration and pressure of hydrogen ions. So the mitochondria has 5 major complexes, and we're just going to refer to them as 1, 2, 3, 4, and ATP synthase is also called 5. In between these we have coenzyme Q, which shuttles electrons, and cytochrome C, which also shuttles electrons. So what happens is that NADH that you've produced either through citric acid cycle or from glycolysis enters into the mitochondria, and it donates electrons and a hydrogen ion. It's a high energy deal here, and so as the electrons are donated, it provides energy to move hydrogen ions up against the gradient. Remember, we have a lot of hydrogen here. That'd be like taking water from here and putting it up on this side of the dam. So we get a lot of hydrogen ions up here, and then the electrons are then passed. They're still very high energy, have a lot of energy in them. They're passed to coenzyme Q, which then moves the electrons to complex 3. Notice we skipped complex 2, we'll come back to that. So they go from 1 to Q to 3, and those electrons then facilitate the movement of more hydrogen ions. Again, enough providing energy to take essentially water from this side up to that side of the dam. And then the electrons are passed to complex 4 by cytochrome C, where they're ultimately accepted by oxygen to form water. So the electrons move down this gradient. They're moving down a power gradient to oxygen to form water. This is where oxygen is consumed. As they do that, they put hydrogen ions up here. Now FADH2, which is also produced, we'll see it a lot more in fat metabolism, but also in the citric acid cycle, it comes in with slightly lower energy levels. So the electrons that it donates come in later in the system at complex 2. And so those electrons donate, FADH2 donates the electrons to complex 2, which then go to coenzyme Q and then to complex 3. Notice that it's bypassed complex 1 and the movement of electrons there and hydrogen ions. So FADH2 doesn't move as many hydrogen ions, and that's going to become key in a second. So as the electrons move down from complex to complex, they're moving hydrogen ions again up against the gradient. So we have a huge concentration of hydrogen ions over here. Oxygen consumption is what allows for the movement of the hydrogen ions. Without the oxygen, if you're suffocating, you don't have the oxygen there, you can't move these hydrogen ions, and that's a problem because then you won't be able to make ATP. Well, the way that we couple the oxygen consumption with ATP production is indirect. Oxygen is not converted into ATP or anything like that. The oxygen is actually consumed to move the hydrogen ions up here against the gradient. So we get a lot of hydrogen up here on our dam, so to speak. And then the hydrogen ions move down the gradient through ATP synthase, which acts kind of like a funnel with a turbine at the bottom where there's a piece of ATP synthase that it will actually spin or conformationally change and provide the energy to combine ADP back with an organic phosphate, forming ATP. So the way that ATP is formed is moving hydrogen ions down a gradient to move or spin part of ATP synthase, much like this turbine over here. It causes a real spinning, and that's what forms our energy or our ATP. We'll go into more detail about this in class. Please study over in the textbook, go on YouTube, make sure you understand the electron transport chain in detail and aerobic metabolism before coming to class. So because NADH comes in earlier, it's important also to note that it yields about 2.5 ATP per oxygen consumed, whereas FADH, which comes in later, will only yield about 1.5 ATP per oxygen consumed. And that's where we'll stop for today.